What is the difference between a good solo and a great solo? And what are some of the skills that you want to develop to go from playing just the right notes to really playing a great solo? There are 3 skills that especially beginners have a hard time focusing on because you're too busy worrying about chord tones and what chromatic note to add in there. But in this video, I'm going to check out the playing of 3 great guitar players, Wes Montgomery, George Benson, and Jim Hall. You can really learn a lot from their approach so that your solo doesn't sound like random phrases on top of the chord progression. When I was getting started playing jazz, then I practiced scales and arpeggios since I'd learned that I needed those to play jazz. The problem I had with my solos was that even if I could play the right notes, then it still sounded very fragmented and messy because I played everything per chord. Let me show you how that is pretty much the opposite of how George Benson plays. My playing at that time was like this. All the right notes, but as you can clearly hear, it doesn't make any sense at all because I'm starting a new idea every bar. I'm always starting on beat 1 and I kind of stop playing at the end of the bar so that I can think about what to play on the next chord. If you want to hear how to do this right, then check this out. So this is George Benson. This is from his solo on Billy's Bounce. If you don't know that solo, you definitely want to check it out. It's an amazing solo. But what is actually different? He's playing from one chord to the next. So if you hear the first phrase, like, that's really clearly going from the A-7 down to the D7, and then he continues clearly to G-7. And also very clearly hitting that C7. Now in this case, it's super clear because I took an example where he's hitting the 3rd of the chord every time, which is a very clear target note to have. Getting stuck with just playing something more or less random on each chord is a natural part of learning how to play changes. But you can quite easily get started fixing this, and it's a really important skill to get in there. So let's look at that and then dive into 2 other approaches that you hear in, well, pretty much all great music, but certainly in the examples of Wes Montgomery and Jim Hall that I'll cover here. That's such a great blues phrase, but it's gonna have to go in another video, I guess. When it comes to bop-inspired jazz, then a core principle in the solos is that often the melodies are dense with a lot of notes, and they're really pushing forward to the chord change, similar to what you heard in the George Benson example. This is not that different from how Bach wrote music, even if jazz uses different harmony and also some extra notes here and there. Now, Hal Galber wrote a great book about this, calling it forward motion, which is a good way to describe it. The simple version of the concept is that you practice playing lines that end somewhere, so you play towards target notes. The notes in a solo line are not just random pitches against a chord, they should fit together as a melody that moves to the next chord, which is kind of also what you of course hear in that Benson example. But there are some things that you can get wrong when you're working on target notes, so here are a few suggestions for getting started. And actually, you should consider buying that book. For finding the right target notes, then you sort of have to forget what you learned when you started checking out jazz chords. I'm sure that you've had lessons telling you that when you play chords, then you just need the 3rd and the 7th to get the sound of the chord across. That would actually suggest that you can also use these 2 as target notes. But that's not true. Let's look at a 2-5-1 in C major. D-7 to G7 to C major 7. The 3rd of the chord is still a great, very clear option, as you heard in the Benson example where he's using it all the time. But the 7th is often a bit vague, and in the beginning you want to train your ear by having very clear notes that tell you that now the chord has changed. On a D-7, then the 7th C doesn't really sound like a D-7 on its own. It kind of sounds much more like a C chord, which is not what's there. So having that as a target note is going to make things more difficult. However, the 5th A is actually a very good target note instead, which is sort of odd because if we're thinking of it from chords, then the 5th is probably one of the first notes that you throw out of the chord voicing. This is true for C major 7 as well. Here, the 7th B will really just sound like you're not really resolving the 5 chord in a 2-5-1. Now, of course, you can play melodies that make these notes possible, but as I said, you want to keep it easy to hear in the beginning. Then you can sort of add the rest later and also start to learn how to target extensions and alterations, because that's possible too. but if you learn the basics first, it's going to be a lot easier. Let's say that we keep it easy and play the third as a target note on all the chords in the 2-5-1, just like Benson. F, B, and E. To learn to play solo lines that sound like this, then you want to practice coming up with, for example, D minor 7 lines that really move towards the next chord. So in this case, that could be the B on G7. And a simple version of that could sound something like this. Or like this. Now, these are of course super simple, and I don't actually have to start with the F on the D minor 7, but I think you can hear how the melodies are naturally flowing towards the chord change. Before we get to the Wes and Jim Hall examples, then let me just show you how you can easily make it a lot more embellished with trills, leading notes, and triplets. Something like this. So here it's a little bit less clear, and the target note is often moved to the fore-and, so. Which also makes it a bit lighter, but that's really just the next step to work on, and it is really just the same concept. If you practice soloing like this, then you will get a lot better at creating lines that have a flow and that don't sound like random things copy-pasted on top of the progression. I would suggest starting with keeping it really simple, so just compose some lines and then gradually go from improvising rubato over a basic turnaround or a 2-5-1 into playing in time, and then take that to some songs. This skill is essential for anything bop inspired, but the next two are maybe even more powerful and a lot less jazz specific. The first one is in everyone's playing, but Jim Hall is truly a master at this. What Jim Hall uses in this solo is probably the strongest melodic principle that we have. It's at the core of so many great solos and great compositions. Check it out. What Jim Hall uses here is motivic development, and it's at the beginning of the solo, so he's still building up and it's kind of clear and easy to hear what's going on. He starts with this basic motif. And then he develops that, moving it around both in terms of where it's played, but also where in the rhythm it's played. So the second time it comes in a different place in the bar. And then he keeps developing. Until now, it's sort of been the same motif, the same notes that's just been moved around and played differently. And now he starts extending the melody a little bit. And then to round it off, before the song sort of moves from, this is on Alone Together, it's in D minor, and sort of the main part of the song here is just sort of cycling around D minor, and now it's moving to G minor. So it's also a logical place to sort of round off this part of the motivic development and then go to something else. And he does that but with this conclusion. Which kind of serves, it doesn't really have too much to do with what he just played. It just sort of serves as a way of getting that transition in there, and then he can start with the next motif. So here he's moving into a much shorter motif, because before he had sort of quite a long phrase that he's working around with, but now it just becomes an interval. In the beginning it's a third, and he's really working with those 8-note triplet rhythms, kind of also working with the fact that Ron Carter that he's playing with here is just playing on the quarter notes, so he can sort of choose to play between the quarter notes, on top of the quarter notes, and in that way create some tension. So he's playing around with that as well. Then he continues up to this third interval, and then he turns it into a fourth interval. And from here, then it seems a little bit like he abandons that motif, because he just sort of connects back into the changes, which of course is a part of playing the B to E7 that's showing up. But then he kind of refers back into it by playing this phrase. So this is all over Jim Hall's playing, but Wes uses this as well. So let's take a look at that from his solo on 4 and 6. The first part of this is actually an example of the next thing that I'm going to talk about in this video. But what I really want to talk about is, of course, the motivic development that he plays right after that. And he starts off with the main motif, which is basic, simple stuff, 4-note motif. And then he repeats that, but then changes the rhythm a little bit. and then the original rhythm, but then of course it's moved down in the chords. And since it's a piece of music that's sort of 4-bar periods, then it's also logical that now he's played that 3 times, then he wants to round that off and sort of finish the sentence, and he does that with a different phrase, just to finish that section and keep the music flowing. Now both Wes and Jim Hall use forward motion and motivic development. It's not one or the other. Actually, some of Jim Hall's motifs have forward motion built into them. Beethoven and Mozart knew how motivic development worked as well. The effect of this as a listener is that you hear something that you recognize, but it's not just a loop, it's not just the same thing, because it's developing, it's changing, and it stays interesting in that way. If you want to learn how to play like this, then the first important step is that you want to recognize these things when you listen to music. So try to listen to solos that you already know and that you like, and recognize the motivic development in there. Essentially, that's how I made this video. Now again, a way to practice this is to solo and try to stick with motifs when you're improvising. Maybe in the beginning, start rubato, just take a song that you know really well, play the chord, try to play a short phrase, and then try to imagine how it should move to the next chord or to the next few chords, and in that way move through the song. Later you can of course start to just sticking with a motif over a song when you're playing in time. But first, try to relieve yourself of the pressure of having to play in time and just lean back and try to hear what the motif should sound like and explore it in that way. Wes uses another melodic technique quite often, and that's also a great strategy for making your solos a longer story by connecting the phrases. I often talk about how music is a language and a place for communication, a place where conversations happen, and this can also be in your solo where you are sort of having a conversation between phrases, which is often referred to as call response. Check out how Wes really nails that. So this is again from his solo on 4 and 6 of the Smoking at the Half Note album. I'll actually talk about another 4 and 6 in a bit as well, because there's another great example from his earlier recording of this song. But here, of course, you have like where this is the call and then this becomes the response. And he does it again. And then he kind of develops that idea. So this becomes, it is already call response, but it kind of becomes a motif. We get this as a call, this is a response, even shorter call. You can really hear how he's working with this and also developing it. Again, I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just like a robot repeating the same riff all the time. Something is happening with it and he's being creative with how it's developed. That's a key element of this. Let's check out the other example from the earlier version of 4 and 6, where he's mixing octaves and single note lines. So that's a really great example of this, where he's really just using, his signature sound, which is the octaves. And again, it's super simple. So it's really just playing the octaves with a simple motif of G and C. And then playing a G minor arpeggio that goes to a C7 by just sliding down to the E. And then the first time he goes, and the second time he goes down to the C. So first a high C and then a low C. Really simple, but in that way also just genius. Another guitar player that is really great at this and has some amazing lines that you definitely want to check out is Grant Green, both in terms of learning some bebop and some motivic development. And if you check out this video, then you can learn something about how he creates melodic but also playable and beautiful bebop lines, especially the part that is bebop that's actually playable on guitar, because it's often quite difficult.